Hey YouTube, how's it going? Kevin Cleary here with another knife video for you. And this time it's a comparison video, another comparison video. I want to justify that just for 1 second before I show you the knives. Actually, let's go ahead and just show them to you. There's the Blur in S30V, and there's the Paramilitary 2 also in S30V. This one's, got the Digicam and black coating. Anyway, now you've got some knives to look at. Let me tell you why I like comparison videos. The first reason is it gives me a chance to pull out some knives that I've already reviewed, I've already discussed, and really don't have a good reason to get them on camera, but I really like them and want to put them on camera, so this gives me an excuse to do that. Number two, it gives me an opportunity to examine and think through my preferences. When I'm preparing for these videos, I get to think, what blade shape do I like better? What handle shape do I like better? Why is G10 preferable over, in this case, Track Tech or lack thereof? So it gives me a chance to look at the knives in a different light, in a comparison, instead of in just a vacuum where they're all on their own and I'm just examining it for its own characteristics. Third, it's a cool way to share with you guys, because the reality is a lot of people who watch YouTube videos about folding knives are doing that because they may want to purchase a folding knife, and so they're, by the nature of that effort, they're comparing a bunch of knives already. So you may as well say, hey, you're comparing a bunch of knives already, why don't I do some of that comparison for you and give you an opportunity to look at a couple of blades that probably are on your list anyway. Now, let's get specific about these two blades and talk about why I think they're a good comparison. First, they're both very, very popular everyday carry knives, and I think they're both pretty well designed in terms of size, in terms of weight, in terms of ergonomics and everything else for everyday carry knives. Both of these are really, really good for that purpose. Two, because of the options available in the Blur, it has a wide price range. So we're kind of at the top of the price range when we get to the S30V or other high-end steels. But in that price range, at the high end of the Blur's price range, it compares very, very favorably. In fact, very, sometimes the exact same price. And I can tell you right now that this Blur is sitting online, I think, for about 119 bucks. And if you go on, let's say, Blade HQ, you'll find their price for a pair of two is 119 bucks. So price point is very, very similar on these blades. Finally, these blades represent two different philosophies about EDC. This one is a little smaller and a little more compact. This one is a little larger and more comfortable. And so that's the other reason. You may be wondering, where do I place my emphasis? And so this video can give you an opportunity to think about that stuff. So let's go ahead and talk about these blades, starting off with size and weight. They're very close, but there are some differences, okay? So let's start with the Paramilitary 2. This knife is 8 1/4 inches long. It has nearly a 5-inch handle. And so that extra length is primarily in the handle. The blade is actually the same length as the Blur, and the cutting edge is actually a little shorter. So the extra length, which is a 1/2 inch more, is all in the handle. And that makes it quite comfortable. Notice when I have my hand closed around this, you can see there's a bit of pommel here exposed, and if I choke up, there's even more so that pommel. Now with this blade, if I have it closed in my hand, the pommel is virtually gone. The fat of my hand covers it up, okay? So, size and weight, they compare very favorably in weight. This one is about 4 ounces, this one is like 3.8 ounces, so they're very, very close. But this weight is kind of more spread out, okay? So you've got a larger overall knife in practically every dimension. Even closed, notice that the Para 2 is larger in length, considerably larger in width, and even larger in this dimension, although not as much. So you see that in terms of how much pocket space it's going to take up, the PM2 is going to be larger. Okay, so even though it weighs a little bit less, the Paramilitary 2 is a larger knife. And so if you say, hey, I've got really big hands, or if you're going to do a lot of really hard cutting tasks that are going to need a larger grip so that you don't kind of burn up your hands, or wear out your hands or get blisters or anything else like that, the Paramilitary 2 is going to be a really good option. On the other hand, if you say, hey, there's a lot of crap I got to carry around with me and I don't like a thicker knife in my pocket because I feel it all day, then the Blur may be the way that you want to go. Certainly, in terms of blade to handle ratio, the Blur does very well. You've got 3 3/8 of an inch and 3.5 inches, so there's only 1/8 of an inch difference in blade, even though there's much more difference in handle. So you're getting a lot of blade in a fairly compact package with the Blur. Okay, now let's move on to lockup and deployment. The Blur is of course assisted opening, and that's one of the reasons it's very popular. Kershaw's Speed Safe is probably, you know, assisted opening. I'm working on a whole video that's going to be just about assisted opening knives, but the Speed Safe is really good because of that. Okay, see how that just falls closed, and now I can finish shutting it all the way. Other assisted opening knives where the spring tension kicks in immediately, they're harder to close one-handed. The assisted opening, the Speed Safe makes these knives very easy to open close with one hand. Notice how quickly and easily I can do that. No problem whatsoever. Now, on the other hand, although this is assisted opening, the Para 2 is no slouch in terms of deployment. And I'll try to do this. It's not fair because this is left hand and right hand, but yeah, see, I'll just do them this way. But you can see that they both open very quickly and very easily, just a matter of your own preference. I will say that spider flicking a knife is extremely addictive. In the days that I carry my Paramilitary 2, I find myself doing this kind of thing all day, over and over. And most people who have a Spyderco will talk about how much they enjoy flicking that knife open with their middle finger. Okay, I really like that capability that comes with a PM2. However, the Blur being assisted opening is also a lot of fun. And guess what? If I carry this knife, guess what I'm doing all day? There you go, just that, over and over and over. Both of them deploy really well. Both of them are tons of fun to operate, especially because of the Speed Safe. Okay, so I'm not going to get into Speed Safe too much. What it does is it allows when you disengage, see how there's no spring tension through all of this range of motion? That makes the knife much easier to operate one-handed, and so that's a real win on Kershaw's part. By the way, there have been some discussions about, hey, those Kershaw torsion bars break on you. Yeah, they do. But what I will say is Kershaw probably has one of the best warranties in the business. They will fix your knife and send it back to you, and not only will they do that fairly quickly, but they do it free of charge. They don't ask you to send any money to cover shipping and handling return. Okay, so that's really nice. So even if the torsion bar breaks, that's okay. Kershaw's going to have you covered, and they'll get you a new one. By the way, I took one of my Kershaws apart to see what the heck, why isn't it working, and of course found the broken torsion bar. And even though I took it apart, they didn't care. They still fixed it and sent it back to me. So people talk about that voiding your warranty, and Kershaw's pretty good about not being a stickler for that kind of stuff. Okay, so let's carry on to lockup, because that is a bigger difference. Okay, the Blur is a liner lock, and there have been some discussions on YouTube. There's a couple of really well-known YouTubers that have had issues with their Blur locking up. Now, I have spine whacked both of my Blurs, and I've done tons of testing to see if I can get them to fail, and I have no issues. Obviously, a couple of people have had issues, and if you're going to buy a Blur, I would say just do some testing when you first get it to make sure, and really do some testing after it's broken in. A knife may act differently after a couple months of being carried than it does in the first couple days. But do some testing and make sure that those knives lock up well, and you can lay those fears to rest. If it turns out it doesn't have a great lockup, again, send it to Kershaw and I'm sure they'll fix it. Now, in terms of strength of lockup, the way that the Paramilitary 2 works with the compression lock is very good. And here's how I can explain this. Let's see if I can zoom in a little bit. Yes, I can. It's going to give me some issues, but hopefully you'll be able to see. Okay, so here's the lock bar on my Kershaw Blur. You can see if I start putting pressure on the knife this way, which would cause the knife to close on my fingers if they were in the way, the compression, this piece of metal goes into compression, and that compression is stretched over a piece of metal about from here to here. Okay, so you've got this kind of thing happening. Imagine my hand is the lock bar, you're pushing down on it, and what can happen is this, right? This is how it's going to fail. It's going to bend one way or the other, and it's going to fail. Now, if you know anything about steel properties or steel construction, you know that the way to deal with compression, so let's say I have this beam, and I'm going to put a heavy load on top of it. Well, what you can do to strengthen that beam is add some members in here that support it side to side so that it can't fall over. And think about this, you know, if you are building something and you put one 2x4 under it and start putting weight on, what's going to happen to that 2x4? It's going to bow, right? So what would you do to fix that? Well, you could put in two other pieces of wood going this way, and that's going to stop the 2x4 from bending. And essentially, that distance is what matters when it comes to putting any member under compression. Okay, when you start compressing a beam, or when you start compressing a column, or some member of a truss or whatever, the distance is what matters. However long you've got, the longer the distance, the more chance of deflection. Okay, now here comes the Paramilitary 2. Inside here, you can't see it, but the thing that keeps this knife locked up is a little insert into the back of the blade. So, still under compression, when I start to close this, hence the name compression lock, when I try to close this, this little piece of metal is pinched between the blade and the stop pin, okay? So, now, instead of having this kind of thing, I have this kind of thing. Here's the stop pin. Here's the bottom of the blade tang. If I try to close the knife, it pinches this little piece of metal inside of the knife, right in here. The difference is, both are under compression, the difference is the length. In the Paramilitary 2, you have a little tiny piece of metal about that big that's under compression. There's no way it can move. Okay, it can't. It's so small that the distance, remember I said distance is what matters. Well, you go from this length, okay, to this length. The metal is the same, the forces are similar, but now you have much, much less distance for deflection to happen. And so the compression lock in the Paramilitary 2 is exceptionally strong. And I know that was a bit of a technical discussion, but when it comes to lockup, the Paramilitary 2 is vastly superior to the Blur. Now, having said all that, are you ever going to put either of these knives into a situation where the lock is likely to fail? If you have a brain, no, right? These are both everyday carry knives. You should not be, you should not be putting them in any situation where you got a whole bunch of force pushing on the blade in this direction. Just don't do it ever with any folding knife. That's not a good use of a folding knife. If you do need to, let's say you're in a conflict and you want a knife that can hook and pull, that's something you do with a fixed blade. Okay, so there's no question mechanically that the lock in the Paramilitary 2 is stronger than the Blur. However, there is a question of practicality. Are you ever going to use one of these knives in such a way that that lock could fail? Probably not. In fact, I would suggest that a liner lock is more than sufficient for any task that you're going to be involved with. Be aware though that liner locks and frame locks have one weakness, which is where this force is going and where the lock bar wants to go. So you've got a blade that's angled a little bit this way. If you get those angles off, if you get them messed up, guess what's going to happen? That lock is going to want to fail because the angles are messed up. So geometry matters more in a frame lock or a liner lock knife. The geometry of the blade tang here makes a big difference, okay? So that's lockup. I know it was a fairly detailed discussion of lockup and one that maybe you're like, okay, turn this stupid thing off. But I think it's important for you to understand why those locks work and what makes it different. Now, let's go on to the handle of both of these blades. Okay, here's one where it's a lot more subjective. because this is a larger handle, this is a smaller handle. And you may say, well, which one's better? I don't know. This one, now, when it comes to how well you can grip the knife and lock in, the Para 2 does win by quite a vast margin. You've got this thumb ramp with extremely strong jimping. You have a large handle with some cutouts that really lock your hand into place so that this knife is extremely solid in hand. It just is not going to move. Okay, if you're doing anything with your knife that requires that kind of super strong grip strength, then this is going to be the superior handle. The Blur, on the other hand, although it's grippy, especially now this particular version of the Blur has the silver twill G10, which I love, but which is not very grippy. Okay, normally Kershaw's put track tech in here, and that track tech is actually quite good. It does provide a lot of grip. Now the jimping back here, everyone who's ever talked about a Blur talks about the fact that this jimping is fairly ineffective, and they're right. The jimping is not doing much at all. Okay, so you need to keep that in mind. Also, the handle is smaller, so if you have a really big hand, you have to know that this handle is not going to be as hand-filling as the Para 2 handle. All right, so on the handle and especially on the comfort, it's got to go to the Para 2, both because of the lock-in, how secure it is in hand, and for the comfort in hand based on size. Now, if you're not as concerned about comfort as you are about how it's going to carry in the pocket, then the Blur may win for you because the Blur is a smaller knife, even though you're not sacrificing anything in terms of blade length. And blade length is where we're going to go next. But I wanted to talk about the handle because we talked about lockup. So handle, I say you've got to give it to the Spyderco. Now, let's go on to the blade. Okay, both of these blades are very, very capable EDC blades. My preference is to the recurve. I really like recurve blades, and so obviously I'm gonna like this a little bit better. However, I'm going to waffle on this because the edge thickness on the Paramilitary 2 is less. So the thickness of metal behind the cutting edge is smaller on the Paramilitary 2 than it is on the S30V Blur. Part of that is because this is a flat grind. Both of these are flat grinds. Both of these, this is obviously a full flat grind. This is a high flat grind. That is, the flat grind comes well above the mid spine of the blade. However, this one is thicker. Okay, that means, technically speaking, the Para 2 should slice better. However, the Blur kind of takes back some of that ground by being a recurve, and recurve blades slice really, really well. Also, notice the belly on the Blur. The belly is all here and it's quite steep. It's quite noticeable. It's much flatter on the PM2, meaning that the Paramilitary 2 in some kind of a slashing motion, let's say you've got a rope here and you're just going to quickly cut it as fast as you can, the Para 2 is going to slide out of that cut more easily than the Blur. If I've got that same piece of rope in hand and I go to cut it with the Blur, if I start here, that recurve and that belly is going to push through the rope more readily and more aggressively than the Paramilitary 2. Okay, both of these for different reasons are going to be very good slicers, but because of the slightly thicker profile on the Blur, it's going to not slice quite as well. Although, the difference is going to be hard to perceive without some kind of mechanical testing device, okay? Blade shape, in terms of just the look of it, I do prefer the Blur just as a look. If you took a picture of this knife and took a picture of this knife and said, which one's prettier, I gotta say, I know there's some subjectivity here, but I'm gonna give it to the Blur. So that's blade and how those two blade shapes compare to one another. Both of them, by the way, are in the same steel. And so this is a very different discussion if you're looking at a different Blur. And the Blur can be had in a bunch of different steels now. I think there's ZDP 189. I know there's LMAX. Obviously 14C28N. Now that's going to considerably drop your price point if you go for the 14C28N Blur. Overall, let's finish off with sort of an overall discussion of these two blades. I think both of these are great everyday carry blades. Both of them do extremely well what they're trying to do. They just do it differently. The Blur favors compact size with a lot of usability. The Paramilitary 2 favors grip and cutting ability and sacrifices size a little bit along those lines. Now, part of that may be Sal Glesser. If you remember, he said in an interview that we design blades around the edge and around the hand. I'm sure every knife company does that to an extent, but the Paramilitary 2 is a perfect execution of cutting power in hand. The Blur, you're sacrificing a little bit of handle grip and comfort in favor of a smaller size, okay? Also, the Blur is aluminum handle, and one of the things that's cool about the Blur is you can get this in a lot of variations. And a number of people have pointed out that the Blur may be the most collected knife out of all the knives in the folding knife market because of the variation. You can get this in purple, blue, green, yellow, every different blade shape you could think of. The Para 2, not so much. You've got satin with camo, satin with black, black with black, black with camo, and then you're done. Unless you go for a sprint run, which is going to cost you. There's some Para 2 sprint runs that I'd really like to have, but I don't just because they're expensive, okay? So, you know, unlike the Blur you can find in all kinds of variations for, you know, around $100. The Para 2, for that, you know, $120 to $140 price range, you're pretty limited. If you want, you know, an LMAX Paramilitary or CPX XHP Paramilitary or a CTS 204P, you know, those things are way up there. You know, you're $200 and above. So that's another area of consideration. However, for my money, if someone comes to me and says, hey Kevin, I really want a good everyday carry folding knife that can really serve in a lot of different capacities, that I'm just, you know, I'm never going to be feeling I need more blade, I need less, whatever. I'm going to recommend the Paramilitary 2 first, okay? In terms of performance, quality, comfort, everything that you care about in a folding knife, the Paramilitary 2 is truly exceptional and really is a modern classic for that reason. Now, if they start saying, hey, I can only spend $70, or I don't want to spend that much money, if they say, hey, I want it in a Tanto, or I want it in a certain steel, or I want different colors, or I need a certain size, then I'm gonna, you know, the Blur is gonna be a very close second. For me, both of these are fantastic knives. I carry both of them. I love both of them. You know, when I'm at home, I'll take both of them off the shelf and just kind of play with them and look at them a little bit on a pretty regular basis. I really like both of these blades, but I'm going to give the edge to the Paramilitary 2. All right, there you go. Thanks for watching. That's my take on the comparison between the Kershaw Blur in S30V and the Paramilitary 2. We'll talk to you later, YouTube. Have a great day.